Well, thank you, Renee. That was I really enjoy hearing the presentations again, even though that I've heard some of this information before, whether it was the information that Allison provided or what Renee provided. It's there's value in repetition, and I think that's one of the learning experiences that we utilize probably to our maybe not our best advantage, but I think it's again gets back to that listening aspect. And let me just introduce myself again, Bill Bartush. I'm with the Gulf Coast Landscape Conservation Cooperative, Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative. There's many times a little bit of a misconception that we're strictly looking at the Gulf Coast in our cooperative. However, as we'll see, what Allison covered, there's a tremendous amount of our geography within our partnership that covers the South Central Plains and many of the issues that go with that. I want to reiterate some of the things we heard from the speaker last night. Bill Foote did a great job in talking about certain aspects of where we can be over the next 5 to 7 days in terms of a group of people learning together, and that concept of mentoring, whether you're a mentor for other people or you find a mentor, I think there's great value in that, and that's what I think this week will give you a great opportunity to do some of that. Either become a mentor or find a mentor. And I think this is going to give all of you in this gathering an opportunity to do some things that are really going to be beneficial in the long run. And listening, I couldn't agree with him more about listening. I think that's why you only have one tongue and you have two ears. You should listen twice before you speak. There's also that value of the eyes to the senses. Listen and look and perceive what the group is all about. Keith and I were talking at that before we started. Everybody's got cell phones now, iPhones, and when I started conservation many years ago, it was not a time when you could communicate freely. You had to think about if you were going to go from point A to point B in the middle of nowhere. You had to plan those expeditions, and you couldn't get on the cell phone or the iPhone and figure out where's the next stop or where's gas. You had to think about that, and now we go to these meetings. I was in a meeting the other day, and as soon as the break was out, instead of people getting together and talking about the information that went on during that session, they're immediately out in the hall, and they've got their iPhones working on their text messaging or your emails, and nobody was talking about what was being said. So, are we really listening? Are we? I guess that's a message to holster your cell phones, holster your iPhones. We'll move on, and with that, talk a little bit more about landscape conservation cooperatives and feeding on. You'll see me repeat some of the things that both Renee and Allison describe. The idea of conservation cooperatives is that it's about this concept of collaboration, of trying to get policymakers, executives and administrators to think along the same lines. How do we add value to the existing organizations that we have in place now? How can a cooperative find those areas that each organization alone or agency alone cannot function? State of Oklahoma, how do they work better with Texas in the Red River? How does the Gulf Coast coordination in Louisiana and Texas work better in that Sabine River and that estuary area in the combined state functions? Very different laws, very different actions. So those are some of the things we do. And again, partnerships that can enable a level of conservation that no single agency or organization can accomplish alone. It goes way beyond the secretarial order. In the conservation arena, as I was growing up through the system, I was lucky enough to have a mentor going back to high school that instilled in me the value of learning and listening and looking at the natural world around us. And I'm one of those lucky people that knew when I was 12 or 13 years old what I wanted to do when I got to college, where I wanted to go, and how I wanted to get there. It's not to say I've got 4 children and each one of them struggled as they got through high school. What am I going to do? And I always wonder why it was that I had that strong vision of where I wanted to go. Whatever that reason is, I feel like it's been a value. It's also been a value that I had 12 brothers and sisters that were younger than I was. So I was able to mentor 12 youngsters, and all of this with cooperatives comes together and says, how can we build a better organization in conservation with each of us in our own organizations and our own agency? How can we not step on each other's toes to break down those silos and find a better way to be more efficient? And how can we move forward in the future? And again, finding those mentors, finding those people that can show you that value and moving along. There's no replacement for good experience working with solid professionals. Spend time with people like that, and spend that time to ensure that we can accomplish those right things in the right places at the right times. And I want to emphasize sound science, good planning, monitoring of outcomes. And it's not just monitoring, it's monitoring of outcomes. What do you want to produce, and how much do you want to produce, and where do you want to produce it? I think it's very important that you put those elements in there and not just say we're going to monitor. And it's always about adaptive management. There's always going to be something you learn that's going to improve on what you do the next time. That's all the way back to making arrowheads. You knew that primitive man knew how to create a better apparatus, but they had to go through trial and error. And we're doing that now. And I really did take the positive side on the key question last night, because I think it will be better in the 21st century. If it's not, then none of us will be here to deal with it anyway. So I think the 21st century will see us in an area where we thought 100 years ago we couldn't be today. I look at geographic information systems and think about all the time I spent with colored markers trying to come up with a dot grid and figure out areas on a map. That's how old I am in the system. That was the way we looked at area and landscape analysis. And look what we can do now with the power of computers. I can remember the day somebody walked into our office and said, we've got a new thing that's going to revolutionize the way we do business on computers. We're going to have a computer that's 64K. You'll never need any more power than that, and it's driven by a thing called a mouse. You don't have to toggle right and left, up and down, and go through your DOS prompts to get to something. And that, I thought was unbelievable. Now look at what we're doing today with cell phones. And this background, LCCs, why, how, who, what, and where. Hopefully by the time I step away from here, that'll be clear in your mind. And talk specifically about Gulf Coast Prairie LCC, the place where we're at, the partners, the resources, how we fit seamlessly with our other LCC and CSC partners, and again, value added. How do we add value? We don't want to duplicate. We don't want to step on toes. We want to find that area where we can find our best fit and use our resources, money, people, time, treasure, talent, to our best use, because conservation dollars are very precious. And where we are in terms of the Gulf Coast Prairie timeline and progress to date. And why we're here, this group I look at as this is a recruiting class for LCCs, is the way I look at it. these are you are the people that are going to be folks that find a niche in some of landscape cooperatives as to where we can go. And I think Nicole's going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit. We'll talk about our steering committee. How's that made up? How does it work? The key elements of conservation and sustainability. But again, the background on LCCs. I'll talk to you a little bit about more than just the background. Again, I go back several decades in conservation. Got a bachelor's and master's degree at Oklahoma State, and almost had to, being from Texas, that was almost, back in those days, it was almost impossible to go across the Red River and go to school without being castigated from your family for the rest of your life. So it was a great experience for me to move across the river and have to read the Daily Oklahoman and not the Dallas Morning News. Totally different perspective. And again, represent a force of change far-reaching and consequential than any previously encountered. That was my experience going to Oklahoma State. Far-reaching and consequential than any previously encountered. And it's all about our relative changes through time. But having the ability to work in conservation starting in the late 70s and into the 80s and seeing how things have changed have been a real blessing. And again, we saw this, these scary graphs of where we are now and where we're going to be, where we're headed. You drive through, being as old as I am, I can go to many areas now that are loaded with subdivisions that used to be wildlands. We got wind farms. We got, Allison had a great fragmentation graphic that showed what's happening on our landscape now. The oil spill, that BP oil spill in the Gulf 5 years ago was another eye-opener. What do we do with catastrophe? How do we deal with it? I think we were fortunate that some things happened the way they did, but we learned a lot there. And, we're better for it. We look at changing land use and agricultural practices. I look at these nicotinoid herbicides, pesticides that are having such an impact, we think, on pollinators. What's that going to do? I think those are all options we need to look at. And years ago we planted kudzu because it was great stuff to reclaim land. And what has that done? We have to learn from our past mistakes. Invasive species, we have duck die-offs, migratory birds. This water quality and quantity issues in this landscape is huge. When I first arrived in Lafayette, Louisiana, 3 years ago, the area around Lafayette and, of course, in Texas and Oklahoma was in that 2011, 2012 significant drought, drier than it's ever been. But yet that was the year the Mississippi reached its third highest peak. Coming down the river, when that water hit the Atchafalaya Basin, the predictions of where it would go changed dramatically because it was so dry in that basin, it was like a sponge. And so, again, we learned from new information, climate information, weather information. It's not static. We have to learn. There's extremes and there's differences, and we have to add those variables at every step of the way. And again, weather conditions and where we're going today with this discussion of adaptive management framework, we want to integrate our planning, design, delivery, and evaluation. And there's several models out there that in the conservation world that we do this through strategic habitat conservation, setting those outcomes and setting your monitoring requirements to where you measure those outcomes. What is it that you want to be quantifiable? What is it that you want to get to? And using good sound science and facts to develop that. The Nature Conservancy has a great planning element called conservation by design. Again, it's all about planning, plan, do, and learn. And each one of our state fish and wildlife agencies has a state action plan. How can we inform those better to meet some of our regional needs that meet some of our global needs? And again, in the old days, conservation, the managers on the ground, they did everything. Biological planning, you had the planner, you had conservation design, managers implemented, and you had researchers doing their thing, you know, and again, the old days, it was one person wearing all three hats. And now you get into this situation where you can now have these teams that work together to plan, to manage, the research, and that's where we're at now, in trying to build these collaboratives, build these consortiums to where we can do this more effectively and more efficiently. It's a way of working the challenge, adapting a science-based, iterative approach to conservation, and we have to focus on the sustainability, capitalizing on our individual strengths and leveraging our collective assets. That is where we need to focus. And I want to emphasize throughout this week that we need a seamless network. LCCs weren't created to form their own little groups and be oblivious to the neighbors to their east or west, north or south. And we're founded in science. We have to keep it there. Let's talk a little bit about the where we're at here. The Gulf Coast Prairie place, the partners and resources, function and form, and some examples that I want to show you. Allison touched on this. There's 22 LCCs. And going back a little bit more in the history of the LCCs, I'm old enough to know that some of this thought process didn't just start with the Secretary Salazar's idea or the 1990s climate. Many of this concept of collaboration came from the flyway councils. If you're familiar with migratory birds, especially waterfowl, they breed in the North, Canada, Alaska, the Arctic. They fly through North America, through the U.S., down to Mexico, Central and South America. How did those countries decide in the 30s to conserve those species collectively and uniformly? It wasn't through the UN. It was through the flyway councils. They were self-directed. They worked together. They pooled money, international funds, to work in those councils, and this started in the 30s and 40s. Those were the initial efforts of the joint ventures, the migratory bird joint ventures, which then were like the umbrella organization that showed us that landscape conservation cooperatives can work for all taxa. So this is where it came from, and this is why you have this configuration of terrestrial ecoregions that form the LCCs. There's 22 across North America, the Pacific, the Caribbean, and we all work very closely together. We communicate well. We communicate with the climate science centers, and you know, where we're at in the Gulf Coast Prairie is this south central United States, and this presents some key challenges because 97% of our landscape is privately owned. There's no other area in the United States that has that high a percentage of private land. Many other areas, especially the West, it may be 30 or 40% federally or state-owned land, what we call public land. In the East, much more private land there, but still nothing near 97, 98% like we have in Oklahoma, Texas, and southern Louisiana. It's just, it creates a challenge that we have to deal with in conservation, because if you're not going to be developing programs that are suitable for those landowners to provide those incentives for them to initiate conservation actions, all the work we do is somewhat moot. And again, the seamless aspect, the southeastern LCCs that I work with very closely, we have a group called the Southeastern Conservation Adaptation Strategy Group, and they have galvanized an effort with all the executive directors of the Southeast states, their fish and wildlife agencies, in order to work collectively in this seamless effort across the landscape. And we also work very closely. I happen to work for Region 2, the Southwest region of the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is located in Albuquerque, with responsibility in Arizona, New Mexico, and of course West Texas. So I work very closely with those Western LCCs as well. And we also have that responsibility in Mexico. So that's the geography we're working in. And I think it's key that in our steering committee, we have executives, administrators from the state agencies as well as the partnerships that are also engaged in conservation across this landscape. We have 3 joint venture coordinators that are on our steering committee. We have administrators and executives on those state agencies, and we have aquatic and reservoir fish partner coordinators on our steering committee too. And Allison talked a lot about the federal agencies. We have 6 federal agencies on our steering committee, administrators that represent their agency. And again, this is how we form consensus, direction, and develop policy. It's not that the LCC makes decisions, it's that we develop a consensus direction, and that policy then, the concept of policy, goes to each one of these agencies and organizations, and that's how things change collectively across the landscape. Each one of those agencies makes decisions. They allocate funds, they regulate, they legislate, they develop direction for conservation that we as a partnership, a cooperative, can inform. We also have 4 very strong non-governmental organizations that have a great impact on a broad number of private citizens across the U.S. When you look at the Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited and the audience they get to, I think that's what Bill Foote was getting at last night. We in the small science community can't compete with the AARP. I don't think we can compete with Ducks Unlimited either when it comes to the sound of the wetland user. Just a little bit about the Gulf Coast Prairie timeline and progress to date. We had started in 2010 with a very rudimentary interim or an ad hoc advisory team that built the concept of the partnership. And in 2011, when I started working with the LCC, we formed the steering committee. We identified 3 broad areas of science, the coastal and marsh habitat group, which when Renee showed some of those initial projects that were funded through the Climate Science Center, this is where that need came from. Marsh migration. How do we identify where that marsh migration is going to occur? Sea level rise. How do we make that a seamless model across the Gulf and not have our individual sea level rise models in the Mobile Bay area, the Galveston Bay area, that don't connect? We wanted to edge match sea level rise across the Gulf so we can look at the entire Gulf system. And that was something that came right out of our initial 2011 priorities. The aquatic in-stream flow issues, you can't say more about that than the issues we have now. And then the terrestrial land cover issues have been great. We've generated a much more robust, precise land cover system to model habitat than we had in the past years. In 2012, we developed and finalized an operations plan and developed our governance. And I want to stress again what Bill Foote mentioned about the policy. We formalized that value-added consensus in our steering committee, our cooperative. How do we form a direction for policy that makes things work for that large group of partners? And our long-term vision of identifying elements and needs for conservation adaptation science. And our science plans, building a network, working groups to implement science. We have a very active set of technical review teams in various areas. We have a science team that works closely together. We build those elements of science, and we target, and at least up till now, we haven't done open RFPs, we've targeted our research projects for needs that the steering committee said, we need this. We formulated a much more strict need. Then we went out to the science community and said, how can we get this done effectively? And that's how we form our proposal process through our technical review teams. It's been very focused and not as open as, say, the climate science centers are. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it's given us some very powerful tools that we can use today when 2 years ago they were just a dream. And so, again, this integrated partnership with the Climate Science Center, why we're here today and this week, putting these pieces together. Again, I want to call this a recruiting effort from the LCCs to this group out here. where we're at now, we've got some good science information. We're at the point of trying to develop some more precise models. We need young, thoughtful, innovative minds to help with that modeling process. How do we bring the downscale climate information in with the urbanization models, in with the fragmentation information, in with some of these things that we have? How do we model this landscape change across many jurisdictions? This is where it's very important that we get the best minds to look at this. Existing landscape, global climate models, urban growth models, how do we bring that into a better effort for policy collaboration? How do we talk about that policy change, that sea change that we need to drive agencies and organizations towards a new thought, a new 21st century of thinking? Building those explicit linkages across the conservation partnerships that maybe not existed in the past. Again, that seamless coordination. We talked about the adaptive management process and pulses and pressures and drivers and stressors. I'm going to reiterate this: urban growth and sea level change. We talk about these things that Allison showed so clearly earlier. Where are we going to put conservation land in the future? How are we going to incentivize private landowners by 2030 when you look at the I-35 corridor and how many people are there? How are we going to find the water to service that many people? How many more wells are going to be in the groundwater system pulling water out? These are huge information elements that we have to deal with now so we can maybe make it to that 21st century. And I want to reiterate this sea level rise. 10 years ago, I was one of those people that, what are you talking about climate change? Until started looking at the Gulf of Mexico, looking at the Atlantic seaboard and seeing what's happening and what the changes are. I spent 10 years in Franklin County, Florida, in the west coast of Florida, and I know that area well. Spent many a day in on that street right there. And this hit home when I saw the water level coming up to the first floor, to that office area in Apalachicola, place that I knew very well. How are we going to deal with that? Do we just put up a hardened blockade? Is that the right way, Band-Aid it? Or how do we build resilience into the system to where we can still utilize that area and not have to fight the storm surge that will eventually come? And again, monitoring those outcomes, being explicit. That's how effective conservation programs will be a part of our future sustainable landscape. And I just wanted to get to closure and say, Jack Ward Thomas years ago said that when wildlife and fisheries conservation gets outside the sports page, outside that last page of the sports column, and moves to the front page, then we'll be relevant. And I think this has happened where we're dealing with these huge wildfires during that extended drought. We had a huge wildfire just here in Oklahoma a month ago. Loss of lives, number of structures. This was unheard of, a couple decades back. This Ducks Unlimited disappointed. That was a headline. And if you're not familiar with what's going on the coast of Texas, water has been virtually stopped to get downstream from the lower Colorado River, the San Antonio River, the Brazos River, because of the critical need for that water for urban areas and suburban areas and human use. But all of that area was once in rice farming. They haven't grown rice down there to speak of for 3 years now, going on 4 years. Those rice farms had a tremendous impact on waterfowl that winter. That's all of our North American water and water birds winter in that area, and huge areas now that were provided marsh habitat and rice fields are no longer there. So these are significant hurdles that we have to overcome. And I think people have heard about the fish kills, Red River issues under investigation, and here in Oklahoma, you'll hear it this week. Landowner rights, water rights. How do we move forward? And with that, I'll let folks jump to the next session. I think